In today's show, we discuss, is there excess mortality in the world today? And if there is, why is it?
And now, the TNT Talk Show, daring to go where other podcasts fear to tread.
Hello, I'm Tony Fasula, and I share the stage with my esteemed friend and colleague, Tayo Boya. Tayo, hello, my friend. Once again, I hope you're keeping safe and well.
Yeah. What the hell, Tony? What you gonna do, eh?
I would love it that you come back one day with a bit of bounce in your voice. You're feeling upbeat, as if you'd won the lottery, and you're like, yes. But I can imagine if you won the lottery, you'd still answer that.
Well, I would love it if one week I came here and you didn't ask me to say hello to the audience. But if that's not going to happen, I don't. It's part of why I'm just like, here we go again, man. That's
Come on, say hi to our audience.
There you go. You see, there you are. So I know it's coming. Anyway, hello, audience. What the heck? Wait. I was thinking today. No, don't worry. That's an easy one. I was actually a little bit down because I was just thinking about my my second cousin. Today is the anniversary of his death, really.
Oh,
yeah, no,
genuinely?
I wasn't close to him, when he died. And okay. I kind of feel, I do feel, something about that. I wish I had been. Well, actually, I'm glad I wasn't close to him because, of course, he died demining in mines in Angola.
Reef. Oh dear, your jokes. Terrible, I'm sorry. Anyway, let's move on with the show. Again, I just want to mention very briefly to our listeners and viewers out there, please comment on our show, whatever platform you happen to be on, whether you like it, dislike it, we still want to hear, and any comments you may have in terms of what we could discuss, in terms of any shows in particular. I know a lot of our listeners actually like our conspiracy shows, so if you do like those kind of topics, feel free to suggest more. We'll definitely look into those for you. Anyway, let's move on with the show today. What we're going to discuss in today's show is there an excess mortality in the world today? And if there is, why is it? Tayo, do you want to kick things off?
I don't think I ought to. This is one of yours.
Well, yeah, it's a little bit strange. There are figures out there that are showing that.
Well, first of all, what is excess mortality?
Well, it's more mortality than people expect to see, because you actually see a rough number of deaths, you work it out with a trend, and obviously we know we've been through a pandemic of recent, but the figures post-pandemic are high or higher than they would have expected. And even though we went through a pandemic, the numbers should have come back down, and they did for a bit, and now they're going back up again. So there is a trend here.
They came back down.
They did slightly, but whether the reporting was there or not, but the figures now have gone back up again and concerningly high. And so we're going to hopefully discuss that here today as to why. So there seems to be an indication that there is excess mortality, but we're trying to answer the question, why? Where's it coming from? Hence the topic today.
What bothers me is what you said about the dip. I wasn't aware of the dip.
Yeah,
so I am aware.
Well, it wasn't across the board. Let's be fair here. If you took a lot of countries together, then there isn't a dip. It seems to have been, it was high because of COVID It did dip, if that's what I'm really referring to, after COVID in terms of things settled down, but it never really came right down to the pre-pandemic levels. That's what the concern is. It's actually, so it had a little dip,
Right.
but it's
Okay.
gone up again a little bit. And a lot of governments are scratching their heads as to the cause.
As a style.
Yeah, and where this is leaving us. What is the cause? And hence,
what do you think it
my
is?
question. Obviously, a lot of people are going to point the finger at possibly the vaccines.
Many. A bit surprised.
Yeah,
I
people
don't think,
are.
in my research, I didn't think that was the case. I expected it to be the case because I first came across this story about excess mortality or excess deaths, if you want. It depends how you want to refer to it. I came across it on I think on a video, which was very skeptical about vaccines. So when I was looking into it, I thought there'd be a closer tie-in between vaccines and excess mortality. But going forward, that didn't seem to be the case. So that expectation that there's some kind of direct link between excess mortality in its entirety, by the way, and vaccines, I didn't see that. I'd be interested to know if you did.
I didn't see that either. What there, mind you, saying that there was a little bit of a correlation in that separately to this was there was a higher number of deaths post-pandemic with the countries that were poorer. So there was a bit of a trend there that the countries that were wealthy were able to afford the vaccine in the beginning in the greater numbers. Their deaths did come down. But what subsequently has been noted is that they've come back up again and quite high compared to where they were before the pandemic. And this is where the discrepancy is. It's strange. And it's also, there's also figures that during 2021, which was the height of the pandemic, the younger age group, 0 to 24, they were obviously really low deaths during the pandemic, but subsequently they've been dying at a higher rate than they should otherwise. But that's not just because of the pandemic. It's strange because a lot of deaths to the younger population have also been those that haven't been vaccinated. So it's a bit of a mix there. It seems to be a trend where young people are dying when they shouldn't be, but there's also a high number of those hadn't been vaccinated but didn't get COVID. So what's the cause there? So you
they
can't
did
put
not get COVID.
Did not get COVID, weren't vaccinated and did not get COVID.
Isn't it entirely possible that some people got COVID and didn't realize it? Because
yes, this is the other. This is the
young people.
Indeed,
they didn't react as say badly as yourself and myself when we got COVID.
Asymptomatic.
Right, and it could be asymptomatic. I believe that some people still are asymptomatic and they can still be sitting next to somebody who's not coughing or showing any signs and the person's got COVID.
Indeed.
So surely isn't that some kind of an indicator that this is what could have happened in that case? I mean, what about a post-mortem examination? Wouldn't that show that the person had COVID at some point?
Yes, it would. It would.
But so do we know if people were performing these post-mortems?
There's still, when a young person dies and the reason's not clear, then yes, they tend to do post-mortems on them to ascertain the actual cause of death. Although the amount of post-mortems, I don't know whether they go into checking whether there was COVID in the blood supply or not.
I don't know if the governments would. Anyway, sensible governments would have, because if they came back with the response that people who had COVID were dying in larger numbers, that would surely boost the desire to get vaccinated.
Indeed.
So you would have thought that governments would have thought about that. You'd believe that governments would have thought about that and said, hey, look, when these young people are dying, please do a post-mortem and test them to see if they've had COVID at some point, because then we can tell people, you see, this is why you need a vaccination.
Unfortunately, that data isn't yet present, and that's the strange thing. There are some theories, because all Western governments are trying to come up with answers currently to understand why there's this excess mortality rate. They don't yet know. The data isn't there yet. It's just a trend that seems to be occurring pretty much everywhere. And that's the worry. Now, obviously, this is ongoing. We're touching on this subject now before all the data has been compiled fully. But there are some early ideas as to what it could be. And Chris Whitty himself, if those of you who in the UK will know who he is, was the chief medical officer for the UK. He said at one point, I mean, earlier on in this, he said that statins during the pandemic may have caused, lack of statins during the pandemic may have caused an upsurge in coronary heart disease, because people didn't get access to the conventional medicines and the conventional health service, because the focus of the health service was pretty much all on COVID. So the other checks that they would normally do were being missed because all the resources were being focused on COVID itself. So could this be an issue where, because the services weren't provided during COVID, they've come now to bite people literally because they just didn't get the access to the medical facilities, seeing doctors, seeing the checks that they would do otherwise. So as the health services have been distracted in terms of focusing their attention on COVID, all the other illnesses have just not been picked up.
That sounds a bit fantastical. The bit about the statins.
Well,
I don't know if just because you put on a little bit of weight, is that going to? I mean, and I've taken statins for not for a long, not consistently over a very long period. But when I did take statins, it didn't make that much of a difference to my weight.
Well, the statins, they say, for them to take real effect, it's 2 to 5 years where you start to see the benefits.
I certainly didn't take it that long.
Well,
that's for sure.
Indeed, and that's it. So that, in itself could be a failing actually on Professor Chris Whitty's comments, because we haven't really gone to that length of time yet post-pandemic.
Precisely. And if you were on statins before the pandemic, you could still go and get them from your pharmacist.
Yes, indeed. Existing people taking medication would still have that, but we don't know. And again, this data is not yet available. Are people who are dying in their numbers people who had no illness prior to the pandemic, or are they existing people who, for whatever reason, are now dying in larger numbers?
Well, my research seems to indicate that it's something I'm going to have to look at my phone here, because I can't remember what it's called, a medical term. Seems to indicate that the instances of something called pericarditis and myocarditis, which are both heart diseases, right? That those are the cause of concern for people who are worried about mRNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines, and the effect that mRNA vaccines is having on us. So, what I understand is that some people are quite happy. Well, not happy, but some people are content that they understand that why we have certain numbers of excess deaths. And according to these people, it's because during the pandemic, when we're all sort of, shut down and locked in and everything, hospitals were really focused on dealing with the pandemic. So a lot of routine hospital business didn't get done. So what you might call routine, for you and me, luckily, would be, I don't know, visits for sore hair or headache there, whatever. But for some other people, it was things like cancer.
Yes.
Or serious diabetes or things like that. And they weren't being seen and they weren't being treated the way we would now. And these things have obviously had to they've piled up these cases. There's a backlog, and some diseases are really time sensitive. If you don't get treatment in time, I mean, cancer is
absolutely
a case in point. If you don't get treated in time, you might end up, as a casualty. And these people are saying this is what they believe has happened. That there's this backlog. And by the way, there were new cases that weren't seen either.
Yes.
So not just the ones we know about.
Yeah, it's new cases. Absolutely.
Totally. There were new people who if everything had been working well, they would have been seen.
Indeed.
The disease would have been caught and they'd have been treated. So taking all that into account, it seems that for me, that's a reasonable explanation. I mean, after that, it's just a question of looking at the data, and I hadn't been into the stats. And in any case, I rarely go into stats. I let other people who are sort of more versed in statistics. It was one of the things, the branches of maths that I really hated. Is I just hated. I really, really hated statistics. It's always affected my studies, in uni and everything, because I just hated stats. It's all monkey business as far as I'm concerned. So, but anyway,
unfortunately, the stats are what underpin.
They do, and I don't think in doing research projects, if you're going to be taking samples and things, you have to take stats to be able to report your results and things. But I just hated it. So I prefer other people to do the analysis, and people I try to trust and I think I can trust, and report back on it. So in other words, what I'm saying is, there's a reasonable, for me personally, there's a reasonable explanation as to why there are excess deaths, but it's up to the statisticians to tell us if that reason covers, the population of the population of these excess deaths or not. I know that there are others. There's a doctor. Sorry, not a doctor. I beg your pardon. What's his name? The senator. The two senators, really. The Senator Ralph Babbitt, representing, I think it's the state of Victoria in Australia, just this February, was questioning Australia's Minister for Health, Miss or Ms. Gallagher, or Mrs., I don't know, Gallagher, and complaining about nearly 20,000 excess deaths in Australia in 2020. 2022, which is pretty startling. 20,000 excess deaths. Only 8,000 of those 20 were attributed to COVID. So he was saying, well, if 8,000, we think 8,000 are attributed to COVID, where did the other 12,000 deaths come from?
Where did they come from?
And Minister Gallagher replied that she had data showing that was for many reasons, and such as Alzheimer's and dementia, and in generally Alzheimer's in particular, which was 21.8% higher during the year to June,
Yeah.
because this session happened in Senate, June of sorry, I'm a bit confused there, because he asked the question in right. He asked the question this February, and this is February 2023.
Yeah.
And she had figures up to June of 2022.
22.
And even by that time, it was 28, 21% higher. So I don't think anyone is claiming that the vaccine leads to Alzheimer's.
No, it
right?
doesn't. Clearly, it
Right.
doesn't.
So this would fit the narrative that it's because people weren't being treated normally during that period of time.
That's absolutely true, but that's not covering everybody, of course, because there was a figure done by the BBC, which again only ended up into back end of 2022. And they said that there's been reported 650,000 deaths in the UK, which is 50,000 excess deaths compared to 2019.
So what period? What year was this?
2022.
2022.
The end of 2022.
50,000 more deaths in 2022.
More deaths, of which only 5% of that number were attributed to COVID. Now,
5%.
5%, yeah.
Just 2,500.
Yep.
That seems incredibly low.
Well, that's above the expected amount. This is what I'm
but
saying.
the Australians, in the case of Australians, it was 8,000 out of 20,000. So as were attributed to COVID. So our attribution to COVID seems really, really low.
Yeah, it does. And they're saying you've got 20% more. So where could the problem be? Is it the reporting of the death? Whereas in COVID, there was a propensity to
over-report
for COVID. And now, is there an issue here where you're under-reporting for COVID? And we still have a problem with COVID itself.
For our seasoned guests, maybe not guests, sorry, for our seasoned viewers, and maybe those who don't follow us that closely, why aren't you following us that closely? We did actually have guests on to speak about COVID.
Yeah.
Very sort of well-informed guests too. So there's a backlog there somewhere. And the guest that we had on, Lorraine, I remember her name, she said that she was aware of the son of a close friend who had died on a motorcycle accident and being decapitated, basically, which is unfortunate. Not nice. But for some reason, that he had done so within a month of having COVID. Do you remember the case?
Yeah, I do.
And they put this death down as due to COVID.
Was that due to the fact
that's in Scotland, by the way?
I know. Was that due to the fact that they were cutting corners because they were so overwhelmed that they put cause of death, COVID, to mean that they didn't need to do any further reporting? So could that have been down to, the fact that it made the news? I'm assuming it made the news because
she said she was aware of it because she knew the parents.
Oh, so she personally knew. Okay,
yes,
so that's slightly different. What I find incredible about that is, was that genuine? Was that we should have challenged her at the time? I can't remember what we actually said, because it could be poor reporting. It could be, someone not doing their job properly, perhaps. I don't know. It seems very far-fetched that I think
she used it to buttress her point that, that COVID was being over-reported because all sorts of deaths were being... I think the NHS guideline at the time was if you died within a month of having COVID, your death was due to COVID.
It was, which seems strange.
That's the only thing she was saying. That she wasn't, So if the young man had COVID within a month of his accident, it would have gone down as, which he was saying, rightly, in my opinion, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. I'm agreeing. Absolutely
right.
agreeing.
So when you're saying, could it be that it's overreported or underreported?
No, I'm saying that could that report itself not be right?
Yeah. I bring up the instance of our guest's anecdote, if you like, as supporting your sentiment that it might be a case of terrible reporting.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to tally with the Australian case. And I'm not saying Australia's reporting is better than ours, but there's certainly some kind of discrepancy. There's a discrepancy there.
Yeah.
Someone is, what is 8? You're a good mathematician, aren't you? What's 8 of 20? It's about 40% or something, yeah?
Yeah.
So around about 40% of Australia's excess deaths are due to COVID. But in our case, it's 5%?
No, they're not saying. Well, COVID-19 accounted for just 5% of the total, which is at that time when the stats came out. So that the higher number is, well, what's causing this death? Now,
this depends who you believe. It could be the higher number is right.
Well, it depends on where your baseline is. What was the original? We had more people being reported dying of COVID during the pandemic, and less people now being reported of dying of COVID post-pandemic, when in reality it could be a high number throughout. And we haven't actually gone, we're just living with COVID now. We're not gone to the point of, locking people down. Because funny enough, do you remember there was reports of people having mental health issues of being locked away? That actually is
some of them.
bigger problem. That's a bigger problem than was made out. Humans are social creatures by and large, and we need that contact with other people more often than not. And there is evidence here that seems to be pointing to the fact that our well-being was hampered in such a way during the lockdown period that it had a really major detrimental effect on our overall health. And this could be a huge contributor to the number of deaths that we're now seeing, that people have compromised their mental health to such a degree that you're now on a decline that, if it wasn't addressed early, could end up with your demise, which is what we're seeing.
So are there any, it's not that there are excess deaths from people who are sort of deleting themselves. So I don't know why how does the mental, what's what I'm looking for? How does mental health come into excess deaths? I don't get the connection, frankly.
Because there is growing evidence to show that if you're unhappy, illnesses find you. In other words, cancer, for instance, is more likely to affect somebody who is got not a depressed state, not quite to that point, but they have been affected unduly mentally. And these bring in not depression, but you have the feelings of feeling lost and unsure and life is terrible, etc. This actually brings on additional illnesses. So your mental health has a huge part to play in your general well-being. So if you're a half glass full person, there's figures to show that there is a greater chance of getting ill than if you're a half glass full, half glass empty. Half glass empty, you're more likely to become ill than someone who looks at life in a brighter way and what have you. Which is one of the reasons why I promote brightness and happy.
Is this just you grifting your motivational speaker?
I'm not. That's a piece of evidence which is actually backing up my theory. Because it's not me promoting that. There is evidence to show.
Sorry. You were saying what?
There is evidence to show that having a positive demeanor increases your well-being.
Okay, so as I hope our guests have figured out, if they don't even know by now, I'm a demotivational speaker. I lead you into a plateau of contentment by asking you to abandon all hope. You know, just let go, give up. You know, and you'll be not you because no one's going to call me happy, but you can see I laugh a lot. I mean, you know, so. I don't know about I don't really know, and I don't know how that really ties in. Because okay, so what they could have,
it's the fact that people
you
were
can't
locked
really
down.
sort of start asking 50,000 people, you know, all the people who died, were you happy or not?
No,
I mean,
no.
well, how are you going to get that?
Indeed, how do you get that? But
So,
what we're generally seeing
would the
outside of the
GPs know?
excess deaths, the GPs know because they do record the
Cases of
disposition of the
depression.
person. Yes, absolutely they do. And if they have conversations with the patient and they detect that they're quite negative or they could be a danger to themselves, they have to record this. And some of them, in extreme cases, they flag it up as well. So it comes up on the patient's record. So they do have this information, but what they don't have is if people during the pandemic itself, when people are under lockdown, obviously they haven't been to see their GP to say how they feel, and they're feeling a bit, you know, restless, uncomfortable, and these feelings, if they're not
Once have been
captured,
recorded. Yeah, the ones have been recorded. So again, would have missed. They could be
indeed,
missing the data in the first place.
absolutely. So although the strategy of locking people down was deemed the right one at the time, personally, from my point of view, of my opinion, I think that was a bigger contributor to the general, there's not a word I can use as well-being. What's the negative of well-being? The detriment of the health of the nation and all around the world, more so than they realized. So in one hand, they're protecting the population from this virus that was spreading through the population by locking people down. But unfortunately, the negative side of that, the lockdown itself, had really detrimental effects on people's well-being, which we're now seeing, I believe, post-pandemic, that people have suffered in such a way, being locked away, that now that they're unlocked, it's all resurfacing and causing them ill health longer term. So seriously, something that needs to be looked at in more detail to try and gather the stats. In fact,
so, as I said to you the other day, in teaching now,
yeah,
and as a teacher in a class of about 30 students, you're always going to find about 4 of them, 4 or 5, sometimes as many as 6 or 7.
Yeah.
Presenting me, and that maybe it's just this school where I am. I have no idea because I've been to a couple of schools. I'm a supply teacher. I'm a cover teacher. I go from school to school. I move around.
Okay.
So in the one school I went to, that number would have been 2 or 3 in the class, but they had smaller classes.
Right.
And in this school where I am more recently, they've got larger classes of, say, about 30 students. And then, like I say, there could be up to 4, say, quite regularly. And they've got these cards which basically say, I've got issues. Please don't ask me to answer questions. Don't pick on me to answer questions.
Wow.
I can have timeouts. I might need a timeout and just let me go, you know, go and stand outside for a while and things like this. So I actually have to start the class. Say, look, if you've got one of these cards on you, just let me know because obviously I don't know you individually.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm just wondering if I had known this was part and parcel of which might be related to excess deaths, I could have asked the question of the school and I said, has this increased since before the pandemic? I wouldn't know because I only started doing this recently. But it's an interesting question to know if
certainly is,
because I've heard that young children were actually affected, and I
Oh,
think I've heard that they
absolutely.
were affected even more than
Yeah,
adults.
they were affected as, yeah, even more because they need that social interaction. So even though, although the fear was with the information that they had, that, you know, the decision makers had at their disposal in the early days of the pandemic, they didn't know how prevalent this was. They didn't know how dangerous it was. What they did figure out was that children themselves were the least likely to suffer from it.
Mm-hmm.
But what they assumed, and I don't know whether that's been confirmed or not, is that they could carry it as asymptomatic carriers, which would then pass it on to people who were older and more vulnerable to its effects. So it is a really complicated story understanding whether or not the pandemic and the strategies applied during the pandemic were detrimental to a lot of people, even though protecting the population
I
was
don't think there's
the
any
primary
question about
factor.
that. I don't think there's any question about that, Tony. And there's no question that the pandemic has, to some degree, caused these excess deaths. I went to the hospital. I think I told you about it. I don't know whether I did so on camera. Sorry, as we were recording or not. But I do remember telling you that I went back to the hospital where I had been admitted into ICU, and I ended up in the exact room where that had been ICU, but was
Wow.
now a waiting room.
Right.
Right. So I was telling the nurse, I said, this is astonishing. You see that, do you see that corner over there? That was where my bed was, and I was actually in there. And she was like, yeah, this used to be a ICU. So
Makeshift ICU
it was
because
a
of all the
makeshift,
number
it
of
was
patients. Right.
a makeshift ICU. Now before you and I as Toastmasters, the very last meeting we had before we decided that we'd stop meeting in person, I said, why are we all scared? We should just, take it on the chin and just let it cull the population. Not
You see,
realizing that I would have been
one of the ones
I
actually.
would have been one of the ones that had been culled. Although I did say I was prepared to take one for the team. You know. And
That's very admirable, but I don't know how that would have panned out. Let's be
sorry.
honest. That's very
Well,
admirable of you,
at the
but at the
time when
time,
I
it's not
when
really.
I got it, and I wasn't
Yeah,
recovering because I got it with my daughter and my wife. We all got it at the same time, and they recovered after 2 days, and I didn't.
yeah,
So at that point, and I was just getting kind of going downhill. I actually thought I was out of it. I actually thought I was out, and I was actually sort of lying in bed, just sort of going, "Well, you did say you're going to take one for the team, so you're going to have to,
goodness
you're
me.
going to have to relax, man." And you know,
Yeah,
but I don't want to give the impression that I was a happy camper about it.
no.
But I, anyway, I think I may have lost the point I was trying to make. It's that, yeah, you were saying that we didn't know how to deal with the pandemic, and I'm because I was almost a victim myself. I have changed my attitude about towards
Okay.
towards the government's response, and I
Yeah,
am now a government supporter because I could have been one of them, which means if I hadn't had that experience, I'd probably still be saying, yeah, we should just have let people just be culled. So when you don't have skin in the game, you
yeah,
can be less compassionate than you ought
indeed,
to be.
indeed.
And secondly, I think it's I don't want to use the word ineluctable. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. It is incontrovertible that the pandemic, one way or another, has caused excess deaths. And I think the secret thing about it is the unmentioned part of the excess deaths debate is whether there's this suspicion by a large number of people is are these excess deaths caused by vaccination? I think that's what it really. I think
Well,
the reason we're talking about it at all
of course.
is that this is what is really sort of
Yeah,
prodding at people. Because if it's shown categorically that no, it's nothing to do with the vaccines, I'm not, and it's because of this other thing.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Again, there is, I mean, we know there is some element of the heart condition, myocarditis, is that right?
Myocarditis and pericarditis.
And pericarditis that are caused, but into some people, not everybody, this is the thing. Some people, especially younger people, older people don't seem to get
younger,
this.
healthy people, which is strange.
Healthy people, which is strange, that this response where the mRNA vaccines can cause this inflammatory response. Now, what isn't presented is that COVID itself can cause that.
That's what I was asking about. That's why I asked about asymptomatic asymptomatic cases. That couldn't it just be? It's nothing to do with the vaccine. I mean, there's a reason. I'll tell you about the reasoning behind people's suspicions of the
mRNA vaccine. Yes,
vaccine. But at the same time, I mean, I know that it's like a flu, isn't it? COVID is basically a flu.
Yeah, it is from the same.
And like most flus, it's does attack the young and the healthy, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Which is a strange thing. It's like I know old people. It attacks the old
people
and
for sure.
The young and healthy, right?
Yeah.
Am I right?
With comorbidities, if you've got an underlying condition, you're unlikely to be aware of that if you're young. This is the big thing, okay? Because young people may have a condition they're just not aware of because it's not prominent enough, but they've got it in their bodies. Whereas older people tend to have more tests as a demographic in the population anyway. So you discover these things as you go along. So older people are more likely to be aware of any illnesses or problems in their body than a younger person. And because COVID affects or seems to affect people that ordinarily were pretty healthy, and then you might get a young person that got COVID, and then all of a sudden they're extremely ill because they had an underlying condition which they were unaware of that COVID has exploited. Now, as you've touched on there, if they were asymptomatic to COVID, you don't know what it's done to the body because they just haven't shown any symptoms for it. But it could have had an effect that was detrimental, which when the person, further down the road, exposed to something else, maybe they put on a bit of weight or they exerted themselves in a particular manner that they haven't normally done for a while, then all of a sudden the scarring or whatever it is that COVID has done to the body has then come to fore. And so it's caused all these extra problems. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just putting that as a possible, because at the minute, there is no answer because they don't yet have the data. It hasn't been made available yet because it's still being collected.
And I'll have to correct myself whilst I have the opportunity. I've just had a quick look and I've gone onto the cdc.gov, that's .gov for those of us in the UK. Sorry, it's .gov.
Isn't that the US one?
That's the US one, cdc.gov. Sorry, United States.
.com is the US one.
No, .gov. There's no com.
Oh, .gov.
cdc.gov. Golf, Oscar, Victor.
Oh, right. Okay. That's the US one.
That's the US one. People at higher risk of flu complications. Nothing to do with youngsters. I'm sorry, that was wrong. It's adults who are 65 years and older, adults with certain chronic health conditions, and pregnant women. So nothing. So these youngsters, I mean, these footballers. There've been a few cases of young, healthy footballers just dying on the field.
Where's that? I've not heard of that. What, just randomly
All over the
died?
world, actually, all over the world. I believe there's been a couple here in the UK. There's been a couple in Latin America that I'm aware of, and there's one or two,
I mean,
one in
the
Africa.
thing is, I can give you accounts of footballers who've died on the football fit pitch pre-pandemic. So heart attack happens. It can't all be pointed at COVID or, in this case, the vaccine as the cause. And we hear examples. Oh, yes, but they were perfectly healthy before they got vaccinated. Yes, there is a risk from any vaccine, but it's not always the vaccine's fault for people dying. You can point the finger and go, well, they've just been vaccinated. It must be that. Without the proper analysis and without the conclusive autopsy to confirm that, it's just speculation. Yes, it's a coincidence and not a good one. But until an autopsy is made, you cannot say it was because of the vaccine. And this is the issue. We have too many people being, I don't want to say emotional, because that's not what I'm saying here, but they're too quick to jump the gun and point the finger, it's that. Because there are still examples of people, in fact, many examples of people who haven't been vaccinated who still have died unexpectedly after being fit and healthy.
I'd love to see some data on that, to be honest.
Indeed, we need to see the data and see it. I'll tell you what is an opportune possibility that this could be garnered is China, if they're willing to do it, of course, and whether they'd even release it is another, for debate, really. But they have had severe lockdown more than any other country.
It doesn't work, though. They're going to have to.
Well, they haven't. They've had to release that, but they were very strict on any outbreaks. They locked people down, and obviously, in the end, even Chinese people were getting crazy being locked down to the extent that they were, and their mental health has definitely been affected. Their physical health.
I don't share videos with you because you don't like harrowing videos.
No.
But I did see a harrowing video of a woman actually leaping from a building. She just got fed up. And the Chinese model of
zero
locking
tolerance
people in was a little extreme, even by my standards. I mean, sort of welding the doors shut. I mean, that's kind of heavy.
Indeed, just a bit. I think there is something that hasn't been highlighted here, which I think they've kept from the population, not to give them the fear. But COVID was actually worse than people were originally told, because of long COVID and the effects that it gives. Normal flu in the past, once you get it and you recover from it, it doesn't linger. It doesn't cause stresses to the body that then impede you for many, many months, if not forever. But what's being discovered with COVID is this long COVID, where it is totally debilitating on the body, and people even now have not recovered from it. Now, that's something which the authorities may have been privy to that information, and hence,
I don't see how. Until somebody actually did not recover in good order, how could they possibly have known for meeting a virus for the first time?
Well, indeed, it's as this information was becoming aware. That's why the original lockdowns were there, because they have to do a risk assessment for the population, and some of the numbers that they crunch are quite scary, and they have to err on caution, and hence why some of the decision making we can look back on and think, wow, that's draconian.
No, not me. Like I told you, I am now sort of the government. I've given them a free pass. I think they did okay given the information. There were all sorts of ways they could have gone, and the way they went is just it was roll the dice and take a chance. I mean, he did that at the time, one of his Nordic countries.
Sweden, I think it was.
That went a different way, and at the time they seem to have gotten away with it, but they've caught up to us now. I think the situation is actually worse than ours now.
It is.
So I'm not going to get that. And that's actually Theresa May, wasn't it? Or was it Boris Johnson?
Boris Johnson.
Yeah, and whoever it was a recent Conservative prime minister, and they're all being pretty useless. But in this one thing, I give them a free pass. I just go, yeah, they did the best they could, and I don't think we could have asked for more.
No. Well, you like I said, hindsight's a wonderful thing. You can look back and you think,
well, you can't ask for more honorably. I mean, you can be dishonorable and say, they should have been better at their job.
Well, hindsight is wonderful. You have a bit more information at your disposal. You can see the outcomes of some of the decisions, like, for instance, when the care homes, that was a big no-no, where people were released from hospital back into the care homes without those additional checks. And they then, literally the virus spread like wildfire in the old people's homes because they had to get rid of them at hospital, but they put them back in the community too soon. And that had devastating effects, which we now know.
I don't know what the alternative could have been. They were making schools into Northampton. We're making schools into like transit camps, in between camps.
Yeah.
And that happened. So
you see,
again, it was.
What happens is you have certain departments that have disaster recovery, in place. They have routines, they have processes there on the off chance that something like this could happen. And the health service, to a degree, wasn't prepared enough for what was happening, because my understanding as well in the US too, that they have pandemic planning in place, but that funding for that was stopped a few years ago. So I don't know. I know that happened in the US, and obviously they've suffered for it because of that, but I don't know whether that happened in the UK as well. But clearly, when a disaster is on the horizon, or a pandemic such as this, you have contingency planning on how you're going to respond. And when you don't have that in place, you are literally making it up as you go. And that's not a good place to be. And a lot of countries, unfortunately, were in this position, and we were too. And also,
we hadn't
timing.
Medical.
Yeah, timing is crucial. If you don't act in a certain time frame, that also bears the brunt and can cause a problem. I'll give you a couple of examples. During the early start of the pandemic, which were noted later, was super spreader events, where you had a lot of people accumulating in one place, which would spread it across all of the people there, or pretty much, and then they go to their homes and their communities, and you're now literally spreading it into places where it wasn't there before. So there was one in particular, was the Cheltenham Festival, which did go ahead because they were a bit mindful, saying it would disrupt people too much if they closed it, which on hindsight they think they should have done. But at the time, you're affecting people's liberties. And this is the question. The government are in a hard position. Do they do it and affect people's civil liberties and freedoms? Or do they err on caution and then get charged for being draconian and stopping people's freedoms? So this is the problem they had to juggle with, not only dealing with a pandemic, which some people in the population deemed as ineffective, but how would they know, being a internet warrior, they're not on the coalface? So the government will have more information at its disposal than the average person. Now, what they do with that information is obviously up for debate, because some of the decision making we can now look back and think, whoa, was that good at the time? We don't know. But even so, they're on a losing streak. Whatever decision they make, there'll be somebody criticizing it. So in your case, you give them a free pass because of the way you were affected personally, but you managed to come through. But there's still some decision making that could be looked at and gone, well, actually, was that in the best interests of the population at large or not?
For me, the foundational problem is not where anyone is currently looking at. For me, the foundational problem is this. We can't trust our government because our government tells lies. We should really have a government that when it says the sun is not going to rise tomorrow, we should all be able to go, oh, goodness, it said that, and we go and we buy candles because we believe them. But even if the government gets up tomorrow and says, I don't know what's I can't think of something, but it's something that is a certainty. We have gotten to the point where if the government gets up and says the sun is going to rise tomorrow, we'll all go, I don't know what's going on, and we'll all go and buy candles. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right?
Why are we mistrusting the government then?
Because they're a bunch of liars.
In what respect? Give me some examples where they've actually lied. I mean, I'm agreeing with you, by the way, but I'd like for our audience and our listeners and viewers
I'm going to give it
controversial.
It's controversial between you and me, at any rate. We're not even allowed to discuss this matter. But Ukraine, Russia, everything like I don't even know. Just give me something if you don't want to talk about that, give me something else that the government has said. It's a lie. Even before you open your mouth, they lied.
We can mention this shortage of fresh produce that's affecting the shops.
Well, no, that's not a lie. That's just idiocy. I mean, you know where nitrogen comes from. You know where you get it from, and then you're going to put them on the sanctions. And what's your plan B? And then you have not nitrogen, sorry, fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer. You know where it comes from. What's your plan B? If you put Russia under sanctions and you don't get fertilizer, where are you going to get it from? You don't have a plan. And then all of a sudden you're surprised. Oh, look, there's no fresh. Well, what did you think? What was going to happen? No, that's not lying. That's stupidity.
I know, but the thing is, they should have made that clear. When you're putting sanctions on Russia, which, as far as the Western governments are concerned, we're not going to discuss that today, but as far as they're concerned, they thought they were justified in doing so. They should have spelled out what the repercussions would have been so that we are now not surprised that they're there. We would have said, okay, we might not have fruit, we might not have veg.
I don't think they knew, Tony. I don't think they knew.
Thought they were that stupid.
I think that because it's like you know. Look, how do you sanction someone by saying, I'm not going to buy your cheap energy. I'm going to get expensive energy. Tell me how that's sanctioning that country.
Well, it is because you're buying
sanctioning yourself.
Well, you are damaging yourself to a degree, but it's point of principle, isn't it?
And don't forget that there's a whole world out there that goes, oh, Europe doesn't want cheap energy? Thank you very much. We'll have that.
Okay. All right. Well, we're digressing from our main subject.
No, the point being that it's not a lie. It's not a lie. That's stupidity. So if you ask me, just say, basically anything.
Okay, let me say Brexit works.
Sorry?
They say Brexit works.
Lie.
You're a Brexiteer as well.
But the way they implemented it was a blooming lie. It was never going to work. We haven't had Brexit. Where's my Brexit that I asked for?
What did you want from Brexit?
Anyway, so the point being that I'd say the foundational issue about the excess mortality thing is that we don't trust our governments, and we've got a very good reason for not trusting our governments.
I mean, going back to this excess mortality thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That this is the foundation. That this is why whatever the government says about excess mortality now, it's government has to work over time and have so many proofs for us to believe them. Because what should really be the case is the government just says this is the reason why there's excess mortality, and we go, oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah. Thanks for telling us. That's where we should be. But because of the way that they lie all the time, we don't believe a word they say.
I think that's quite a sweeping statement that they lie.
I don't.
All the
time. Because Tyler doesn't believe a single word they say. I actually assume that everything they say is the opposite of the truth.
I'm not sure about that. I think we apply Hanlon's razor here. And for the benefit of our listeners and viewers aren't familiar with Hanlon's razor, Hanlon it's like a term that's referred to. And what it means is that where people mostly think there's malice, it's actually stupidity.
Well,
So,
the exact razor is favor incompetence over malice.
yes.
So just believe that people are incompetent rather than straight go to
Yeah.
to
Because
malice.
because I know people think, oh, they must be doing it for, I don't know, control
Doing what
or
for control?
some benefit. No, but what conspiracy theorists think, where the government is lying because they want control or they're trying to reduce populations. We've heard a lot of these things.
Yeah,
It
but if
isn't
you're trying
that.
to
It's
reduce population, then the vaccines are pretty useless because I mean excess deaths, 50,000 in a population of 17 million.
I know it's
It's
pointless. It's
neither
just I know, but this is
neither
what
here
I'm
nor there.
saying. I'm saying it's
Although some people are saying, I don't know if I've mentioned this in one of our recordings, that I've read that there is a super virus out there that will be, I can't remember what percentage. I may have told you about it. Apparently, it's sitting in some lab somewhere. Guess where? In China, where else? It's sitting in some lab, and that this pandemic was a trial run. They want to see what would happen, and they knew that it was a low fatality virus, is 2%, but that the virus that they're cooking up is, I'm guessing, it was between something like 40 and 60% mortality rate, and they're just waiting for the right, getting all the data in and everything, and when they're ready, this new virus will come out. And it's even got a name.
who's
So,
even come out with this? Where's the evidence to back up that claim? That
well,
just seems so far fetched. It's unreal.
well, people,
This is
when
where this is the problem
conspiracy
with
theorists.
conspiracy. This is the problem with conspiracy theorists, right?
I've asked one online, not to do with this, but I asked him, just where do you have evidence, for this, and just never go back to me.
No, they
He's just
don't. They don't.
they
It's
always
just a
tell you
throwaway comment.
they
Oh, it's
always tell
because
you
of this.
go and research it
Yeah,
yourself.
I know, but that's because they don't have an answer.
No, no, I'm saying that's what they always say. Say, well, go and research it yourself. That if when you see the big picture,
Yeah,
and you're
it's all
like,
that's a sign of arrogance. Oh well, I know what you don't know. Well, if you can't research yourself, you must be a fool.
yeah,
Hold
but
on, you're
okay,
coming up with a
yeah,
claim. Give me the evidence.
I am a fool. Go ahead, but educate me.
Educate me then. Give me
Show
the
me where you
info.
got this from, and they can't tell
Yeah,
you anything.
I'm sorry. If
But
someone's going to
anyway,
come up with something like that, provide the evidence to back it up.
yeah. But anyway,
But that's
that's
separate.
what some people are saying. So the coronavirus response and vaccine and everything could have been, might have been, may have been just a what's the word?
Precursor, dry run.
A dry run.
Oh, okay. I'm more of the opinion, going back to Hanlon's razor, that someone made a mistake and let it out, rather than this planned approach that
You
it
actually
was.
think you're weird. You actually think, I don't even think you're actually a bit of a conspiracy theorist there, Tony, because you actually think that it was man-made in that case, which I don't think. I
I
think it just
don't.
crossed
I
over
don't
from
think it was
bats or something.
man-made. I
Sorry?
I don't think it was man-made. But if it was,
Hmm.
okay, again, if it was, which I don't think it was, but if it was, had it got out the way it did, it would have been a total, pardon my language for our listeners, a cock up by somebody mistakenly doing it, rather than it planned with some malice and malintent in the background.
Yeah. I don't
Anyway,
even know where did it even come from?
well, we don't know. It can happen. It can happen. Anyway, I'm mindful here. We're getting to the end of the show. So a sum up here on this topic of, is there excess mortality in the world? And if so, why?
Oh, there is excess mortality in the world. It's because of the way we handled the COVID, and in large part, it's because of the way we handled the COVID pandemic. And to some extent, well, no, and it is possible that to some extent it is because of the mRNA vaccine, although I would say that the evidence for that right now is pretty flimsy.
It is. Who knows what?
That's my take.
Okay. Who knows what will further be divulged as they get more data in? But if you remember, just very quickly, do you remember we in the UK, we didn't have the mRNA vaccines? We had AstraZeneca.
I think my second vaccine wasn't a Pfizer.
No, your booster would have been an mRNA.
That's what I'm talking
exactly. But the previous two were not. So why then did they stop the AstraZeneca one and give a booster of the mRNA one? Which is strange.
It was supposed to be better because at the time when I got the Pfizer, I thought I was getting the better one because the effectiveness was supposed to be in the 90s and the AstraZeneca was supposed to be in the 80s.
Yeah.
So that's one reason I actually even was glad when I got the
There's
Pfizer
actually some evidence about the way it was reported. It wasn't as effective as it was claimed to be, but then any of the vaccines were, because it wasn't absolute effectiveness. It was relative effectiveness. And that's a true figure, but that's for another topic for another day. But so in other words, the how can I say, the 95% protection against COVID was overstated. It was never as high as that. The figures could be made to look that high, but in reality, it was lower. All of them were conversely. Stats again, yeah. All of them were lower. They had a benefit, of course, but wasn't as good as what they claimed. So that's something in the data, the way it was presented, but it is what it is. The negative press around it, I'm still debating whether that's true or not, but we still haven't got the answer of why we've had these excess mortalities. The people out there want to put a finger on it being the vaccines. I don't think it's that, but something else has happened, possibly due to the lockdown itself, which has affected people in a negative way. And it could be multifaceted. It isn't one thing that's causing this, but a whole range of things that now have come to bite us on the bum. So that's my view.
Okay.
With that, unfortunately, we have reached the end of the show for another week.
Bye.